you. We had one of our instructors actually has made a song about J.D. Perky, and I'm not sure where he's at, but if he comes in, we might have him play his little song.
You mean JB or your?
No, it's not JB, but it's our instructor. He's kind of dressed like JB, but it's a great.
It's pretty cute, yeah.
So we only have one microphone to share, fellows, so I'm going to be passing it down. One of the books, or actually the book that you received, Leadership is an Art, by Max Dupree, as Dr. Friedman mentioned earlier, has a section in there on tribal stories. And Tom has really been a champion at Francis Tuttle for keeping alive the tradition of our, not only Francis Tuttle's tribal stories, but really the system's tribal stories. Because what they will probably mention is that when they go to meetings and things and they ask people, how many of you actually worked with Dr. Francis Tuttle, the hands are getting fewer and fewer. And so it's so important to continue those traditions and tell those tribal stories so that we can appreciate really what it took to get to where we are today and be very appreciative of the system that we have. And one of the excerpts, actually, I stole from Dr. Friedman, and what he liked about that book was every family, every college, every corporation, every institution needs tribal storytellers. The penalty for failing to listen is to lose one's history, one's historical context, one's binding values. Without the continuity brought by custom, any group of people will begin to forget who they are. And our panelists today want to make sure we don't forget who we are. So as we get started, we're going to do this a little bit differently. I'm not going to introduce you all. I'm going to have you introduce yourselves. But then we'll start with Dr. Friedman. And then if you guys feel like he missed something in his introduction, we would like for you to share. And so we'll take turns doing that.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Lifelong career tech educator. It's all I've ever done. Graduated from Oklahoma State University in marketing education. Like I mentioned earlier, Dr. Lucille Patton was my advisor at that time, and I actually started as a marketing major, and I complained to somebody about not having an advisor because it always you don't really get a real advisor until your junior year. And someone said, if you go into marketing ed, you can get an advisor right away. So I just wanted somebody, a warm body to talk to. And after about 30 minutes of Lucille Patton, I was a marketing major marketing education major that next day. First job at Putnam City West High School, and then spent some time at Great Plains Technology Center when Bruce Gray was superintendent, and then had two different tenures at State Department of Education. The first one when Francis Tuttle was state director, and the second one, just as Dr. Tuttle was going out, Roy Peters was coming in as state director, and then left the state agency to come to Francis Tuttle, and I've been at Francis Tuttle since '97.
Let me wrap it right here. Yeah, choke me.
And Tom is a nimble of foot in the fishing stream of the Lower Elm.
That's right.
That's what I remember, man. Tom always in conversations, he was talking about people that always put humor in the conversations. When we're talking with Tom, either informally or formally, he'll throw a fishing story in now and then. The guy lives and breathes and dreams fishing all the time. So, but I think that's a good trait because that keeps you relaxed.
That's right. And humble.
And but you do have a state record, don't you?
No.
I thought you had a smallmouth bass state record.
No, I won a national fishing contest once, but
Tell them about it.
Well, on another hike, I did a 13-hour hike up to Hossack Lake in Colorado. That's just outside of Solid Springs in the Wapakonoochee wilderness area, way above the tree line. And I caught a cutthroat trout that was 19 inches, which that year was the national record. Now, that's not a national record fish. It was just a large, like Field and Stream used to have their fishing contest. Well, the National American Fishing Club has a contest as well, so that's what that's all about.
There you go, Tom. See, he's famous in other parts of the world. Well, I've been in education, be 44 years soon. I worked in common education, K through 12, as a high school science chemistry teacher, then became a coach and principal, And then I got a call from this guy right here one Saturday night, 1981. He said, can you come to work at Canadian Valley in about Monday? I think he called me on Saturday night. And I started working in 1981 in Career Tech as a Director of Student Services for Canadian Valley, where Joe is now, and started at Chickasha campus. Then went to work with Roy at the El Reno Center. He was superintendent at that time of our entire system, and then became assistant superintendent there. Did that for a number of years. Left the state of Oklahoma in 2001, worked in Branson, Missouri for a while, actually managed theaters for a while, which was an interesting endeavor. You know, cheerleader coaches and cheerleaders are hard to work with. Band guys are hard to work with, too. But also worked in the school system in Branson there. The toughest job I ever had in my life was Director of Transportation in Branson Public Schools. Joe, that was the hardest job I ever had. You talk about go to work early and leave late. Boy, that really cut your teeth. But anyway, I got an opportunity to come back to Oklahoma and do something I always was interested in, and that was working in our professional organization. And got a call again one afternoon from one of my colleagues here in Oklahoma, Phil Wall, Central Tech, said, Pat, would you be interested in coming back and being the executive director of our state association? And I said, really? I thought it was a dream. But it was like my New York Yankee job. I mean, that was something that I always thought I would really enjoy, and I do. And I've been doing that now 10 years, it'll be 10 years in February, and it's really been an extremely rewarding experience. I'm retiring soon, but I don't regret any of the people I've worked with, the committees I've worked with, and the leaders in that organization. Of course, I work with politicians a lot, and you know, I can tell a lot of stories about some of that, but that's also challenging and frustrating sometimes, but it definitely tests your mettle, Tom, in leadership and in relationship building. So it's been a great career.
Let me add something to your own deal.
When I was at Great Plains, we had this principal at Elgin High School. He'd send about 98% of his junior, senior class to Great Plains. And I remember the first time we presented this report to Bruce Gray, superintendent, I said, what's happening in Elgin? And Mike Bailey said, we got us a principal there that you won't believe. And then after about another year, he said, they got to find some way to get him into Great Plains. You know, we got to get him into Career Tech. Well, I would suspect, Roy, that you had a conversation with Bruce Gray, and he probably recommended Patrick to you as that director. But Bruce would have hired him too in a New York minute.
Well, the advantage of going last is that I can top these boys. In Danny Goebel's history of Votech in Oklahoma, there's a passage in there, one of my favorites, that Roy Peters was, if anybody had ever been born to be in vocational education, be state director of Votech, it'd be Roy Peters. And that's almost true. This is my 72nd year in vocational education, in that my dad was a superintendent of small schools in Grady County. I grew up principally in Ellick, and I can sort of remember, and the stories over the years have enhanced my memory, I'm sure. Larry Hansen, who I replaced at the State Department when he retired in 1984, coming to Ellick and talking to my dad about starting a Veterans Agriculture Program. The year before, my dad had started the Vocational Agriculture Program. He then went on to start vocational home economics and vocational business, and this was in a little school that graduated in my class, 23 students. But he believed back then that students learn differently, and not everybody is going to learn in the more traditional classroom setting. And one of my classmates, who I think did not graduate, but stayed in school longer than might have otherwise, Ellis Foster, was a whiz-bang auto mechanic. And so instead of going to certain classes each day, my dad, Roy Peters Sr., would let him work on the buses or work on the school car or work on somebody else's car. So I really kind of looked back on that as I started my career in formal career in education actually 50 years ago this month, and I was putting that in context coming down the turnpike today. that I started teaching in 1964, and if I had been listening to someone like me who had begun teaching 50 years ago in 1964, I'd be listening to someone that started in 1914. And so it kind of, it's pretty useless information, but it's pretty interesting. So I was elected national president from Ellick High School in Bethel, LA in 59, I guess. And went on then to teach at U.S. Grant in Oklahoma City. Was a distributive education teacher the same period of time that Tom was at Putnam City. And spent a couple of years in the early days of adult education working for the State Department, actually doing adult vocational education in marketing. And then got a call one day from Clovis Weatherford, who was new superintendent at Moore Norman, asking if I'd be his assistant. I did that for 5 years, then moved to El Reno and spent 5 years as superintendent. Thought I would retire there, and one day get a call from, well, I'll say the story, but anyway, get a call to see if I'd be interested in following Francis Tuttle as state director. And so I went to Stillwater in 1984 as associate state director, and then in 1986 became state director and served 13 years. The last part of my working life, I spent 13 additional years as president of the Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance, and I know some of you have manufacturing extension agents in your school, and that was a terrific transition from a high-stress, fairly high-profile job into a more normal life. In the last 3 years, I've been fully retired. Spent this morning serving as the vice chair of the Tulsa Development Authority, which is engaged in downtown redevelopment, housing development for the city of Tulsa. We'll leave here this afternoon, go back to a board meeting for not-for-profit that trains incarcerated women to be dog groomers. Really one of the most rewarding activities I do every month. And serve on church boards and that sort of thing. So it's delighted to be here. I am always impressed with the new young people we have coming into the group, and hope whatever we say today can contribute to your success.
He did mention that when he was superintendent, one of the first things I noticed about him in his office is he had a little, I actually was in Roy's old office at Canadian Valley in the last 15 years when I was up there, but Roy had this little typewriter. It was a little typewriter.
Honking typewriter.
Yeah, a what?
A honking typewriter.
A honking typewriter. And he did not trust his secretary to write his own letters. So I came up there one time and visited. I think Jim Moore brought me up or somebody, and Roy's in there typing his own letter. I thought, damn, Roy, let your secretary write your letters. That's because of your background, right? In as business, he got after on that typewriter. Boy, he could burn that thing up.
Still could.
Said he still could.
Okay, so one of the things I've learned from Dr. Friedman is there were really 4 men that we could probably credit with creating our world-class career tech system in Oklahoma. And those include Dewey Bartlett, Henry Bellman, J.D. Perky, and Francis Tuttle. So I'd like to hear from the panel information that you can share with us about how did that go in the beginning? How did those people come together, and how did they have the foresight to create the system that we have today? And if you could include things such as the governance, the funding, maybe even how our state board of career tech is slightly different. And you might also include how it's different from other states.
I probably was just a little bit young when all that was happening, and but one of the greatest things that ever happened to me one time was when Larry Hansen, and that was kind of my mentor when I left Great Plains to become his assistant. He had to give a speech in Altus, and he had gotten just the world's worst head cold. He just couldn't hardly talk. And he said, "You're going to have to go down to Altus and give this speech. It's like a Lions Club." And I had no clue what I was doing. He said, "It's okay, I've got my notes here," and I wished I'd have kept that yellow tablet. And that's, that PowerPoint that I do, was based on Larry Hanson's yellow notes, and talked about, the Senator Dewey Bartlett and the job getting us governor, and all those little cliches that I bring in. I wasn't physically there, but I got those off of Larry's yellow tablet. And it was one of those situations that I was very blessed to be able. That was probably the biggest break I think I ever had, was when Larry got sick and he asked me to do that yellow tablet stuff. Lonnie Abbott, that was a guy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Lonnie Abbott was a key player. There was a fifth person. Lonnie was probably I think the appropriations chair on the Democrat side, and made sure the Democrats were already on board. But first-hand knowledge, just a tad before my time. Maybe Roy can shed some of that stuff on there, because Roy spent a lot of time. Dr. Tutter, during those 2 years when Dr. Tutter was state director and Roy was picked to succeed him, I'm sure there's a lot of conversation that took place on that.
You want to take up there?
The four were who?
Debbie Perkey, Dewey Bartlett.
Henry Bell. Okay. Let me kind of start in some sequence here. J.B. Perkey became state director in 1942 and served as state director until 1968. I was born in 1942, so it's sort of a memory for me. He was a consummate politician. He and Roy Turner, Governor Roy Turner, were best buddies. Cattleman. Roy Turner was a cattleman by profession. And Mr. Perkey was the state supervisor of BOAG, and incidentally, I guess, maintained the title of state supervisor of BOAG even while he was state director. That was, and there's lots of stories behind it. There's lots of messages, Pat says. Mr. Perkey knew Washington like the back of his hand. Mr. Perkey, I never knew him, and as far as I remember, I never saw him. He died shortly after he left the state director's office. But I've heard all the stories about him, and I have never wanted to be like him. He was, stories are that he was loud.
You were tall like him.
And he was about my size, right about his size. And but he's reported to say something like when he was talking on the phone, he'd say, "Well, that old son of a bitch in Washington's doing such and such and such and such." And he was talking about the President of the United States when he made that comment. But he was a real deal maker, and he was probably the right man in the job for the time. Very sexist. When Dr. Tuttle became director in 1968, the first action Dr. Tuttle took, literally the first day he was director, was to equalize the salaries among the state supervisory staff. There were just as many home ag programs as there were ag programs, but the ag supervisor made a whole lot more money than the home ag supervisor did. And if it was a female, they made a lot less money and so forth. But he knew how to cut the deals. He knew how to get the money, both at the state level and the federal level. Dewey Bartlett ran for office on the campaign. Incidentally, Dewey Bartlett's son, Dewey Bartlett Jr., is now the mayor of Tulsa. Dewey Bartlett, when he was running for governor, would speak at Blanchard, and part of his campaign routine was that after the speech, he'd go to the house of whoever invited him to speak there, and they'd sit around the kitchen table, the story would go. And candidate Bartlett would ask, what do you want from our state? And he would tell that consistently, the answer was, we want jobs in Oklahoma for our kids. And when our kids graduate from high school and college, we want there to be jobs here. And so he recognized actually, he was I never can remember which, but he was a graduate of either Princeton or Harvard,
Yeah.
Something like
Yeah.
that. And so he had a lot of classmates that had become the captains of industry, president of GM or president of General Electric, and that sort of thing. And so he would ask them then, our people want jobs. How do we create jobs here? And they said, well, you've got to create wealth, and the way to do that is to attract manufacturing. How do you attract manufacturing? And the answer from these captains of industry always was, well, you've got to have a good vocational program so that people have the training that industry needs. And so you don't have to follow those dots very long till you begin to see that with new state director and Francis Tuttle, the Vocational Education Act, which provided federal funds for the construction of variable tech schools. People like Art Alexander, who went to North and South Carolina to study what were then the two best vocational systems in the country, coming back and saying, if we're going to put in, listen to these figures, $100,000 machine shop, which was about what it cost back then, we shouldn't put in a $100,000 machine shop just for high school students or just for college students and community college, junior colleges. We ought to put in a program that can serve both high school students, adult students, and for sure serve business and industry. Henry Bellman, of course, was governor twice. He was governor first time in 1964, just before Governor Bartlett, and that was when the deciding was done about area schools. Constitutional amendment was passed when Governor Bellman was governor. Kind of an interesting sidelight, his Marine buddy was a guy named Wayne Miller, who was I don't think they were presidents back then, but what would now be called the president of OSU Technical Institute in Okmulgee Tech. And Wayne Miller took the position that we just needed one vocational school in Oklahoma, and that was going to be at Okmulgee. And Governor Bellman actually had to go against his Marine comrade to not just allow the vocational VOCAD Act, but to encourage its passage, the state constitutional passage. When he was governor again in 1984, does that sound right?
Henry Bellman.
Henry Bellman, yeah. When he became governor again, it was in a period of immense transition from the old vocational education to the new, more technical education. And he could not have been more supportive. I am so tempted to kind of chase a rabbit over here because that made me think of 14 stories that I won't tell. More is known, of course, about Francis Tuttle. Dr. Tuttle had been a vocational agriculture teacher down in southwestern Oklahoma. He then been a superintendent in southwestern Oklahoma. Then he moved to Holdenville and then ultimately to Muskogee. And if you drive past the Muskogee High School today out on the Muskogee B line, that was built from a bond issue that was passed in Mr. Tuttle's time as superintendent there. Very controversial because it was so far out in the country. But Mr. Perkey, when the VOCAD Act was passed, knew that he needed somebody in the State Department that knew not just public education from the administration that standpoint, but also understood vocational education. And so that caused our Mr. Tuttle to be brought into the state agency to really spearhead the creation of the area tech schools. And we can talk a little bit about kind of how that evolved in a minute. Dr. Tuttle, of course, then Dr. Tuttle was every bit as good a politician, by the way, as he was an educator. He was so good at both the state capitol and the federal level at getting things done. He was so good at the local level with local school boards, selling them on the idea of the area school concept. And but he also became really a world leader in vocational technical education. And I love to go to meetings with him, particularly controversial meetings, where he would sit and listen and let the arguments fly back and forth. And the first few times I think, why doesn't he say something here? You know, he knows better than that. But he'd let that go until just exactly the appropriate time. And then he'd rise, and he'd kind of bow his head modestly, and he'd start the sentence with, well, and then whatever it was, everybody'd begin to nod. So that was a long answer, and I apologize.
Fantastic, Roy. Some of the things I remember about J.B. Perky, I didn't know J.B. Perky either, but of course his legendary style and personality and the effect on the system is just vastly historical. But the things I remember about J.B. Perky is, if you remember when he was director of VOAG in the state, in the 40s, right? What was going on right then? World War II. The government decided along about in the mid-40s that we had literally millions of soldiers and people working in the service of the military and backing up all the efforts of the war effort. And they were about to enter the workforce at the end of the 40s. And the president and some of his, President of the United States and some of the individuals involved with this decided they need to have a blue ribbon group of people to work on how are we going to put these soldiers and returning veterans back into the workforce. And they came up with a plan, and one of the individuals that was on those original committees was J.B. Perky, because he had been involved in, of course, the Strong Agriculture Program, leadership in Oklahoma from way back. By the way, J.B. Perky was one of those guys that when he told his VOAG teachers that we're all going to join OVA at that time, or the National Agriculture Education Teachers, everybody joined. There was no questions asked. So when you hear about that culture of professionalism that's carried on today, and when we talk about it, when I talk about it, when other leaders like Tom and Roy have talked about it, we actually are the children of that philosophy that we're all going to do it, because if you don't, you lose your strength in numbers and you're not able to be successful. So J.B. Perky was that kind of guy. And also when he got involved with what they were doing in Washington, you can guarantee that when he came back to Oklahoma, it was going to take place and it was going to be good and everybody was going to help. So it was that personality, even though it was a lot more aggressive than the style we saw with you or with the Francis Tuttle, it was effective. And it was
at that time was
at
probably
that
right.
time it was really appropriate. So in my family, my father was one of those returning veterans, and you know it was tough times back then. My mom and dad both told my sister and brother and I about it. But my dad was one of the first soldiers that came back. They got into a agriculture mechanics program in McLean County, Oklahoma, and learned how to weld in, and learn so he could go back to the ranch and take care of it. So my mom went to business school, and she worked in the war effort in Texas during the war. So he was not only important in vocational education, but just in the general well-being and economic development of Oklahoma. He was a tremendous leader. What I remember about Henry Bellman is I had the opportunity to meet him several times. My mother was very active in politics, kind of where I got some of the blood and spirit I have about that. But she would take us to deals where we were handing out flyers for you know, at that time we campaigned for George Nye a lot and J. Howard Edmondson and stuff like that. But, you know, Henry Bellman was a Republican, so it was just kind of interesting that Oklahoma might elect a Republican, but first ever, but they did. And then, you know, all the naysayers would say, oh, well, Oklahoma's going to go to hell in a handbasket now, you know. Everybody will starve to death and, you know, won't take care of the poor and all this stuff like that. But it was just the opposite. In the 60s, I lived on a ranch in eastern McLean County. We had a drought, much like we've had the last few years. We couldn't feed our cattle. And Henry Bellman came up with a tremendous plan to get government feed and cheap maize feed. And it saved our herds. It saved us during those years. So he was always a hero of mine for that. And then when I saw what he did for vocational education and for career tech in Oklahoma, where he went to fight where a lot of his colleagues and other leaders in the Republican side of the state wouldn't do it. He stood up, helped us get through some tough times, get legislation passed, and made it happen for us. I never forget one time he came out to Canadian Valley, and we had visitors from Saudi Arabia, a delegation from Saudi Arabia, Tom, that Arch Alexander had to escort around the state, and Henry Bellman stopped by to speak to them. And Henry was a man of few words, was a big man, but when he spoke, he was a lot like Dr. Tuttle. When he spoke, you better be listening, because it was well thought out, it was to the point, and it was going to be a good plan. So just a chance to meet him and talk to him for a few minutes was a thrill. And by the way, those Saudi Arabians that were here, they liked our career tech schools, but they were really interested in where our lakes were, because they wanted to go to the lakes to see the ladies swimming in the lakes, because, you know, you understand the culture differences there. So, and also we made the mistake of serving lunch to them with bacon in the green beans. So that was a big mistake. We had to kind of do some backpedaling on that. Those two.
Go.
Okay, so talk a little bit about the governments. You mentioned it is in the Oklahoma Constitution, which is a really big deal, and I don't know if everybody knows and understands that. But then you know how the system is set up and how it's set up differently than other states. I think that's one of the reasons it's so important to know and understand the history, because we have to protect that, and we have to remember that it can be taken away just as easily as, well, it may not have been easy to get it, but it could probably be taken away pretty easily. So why don't you guys share a little bit of history about that?
I'm glad I'm prepared for this.
64 years.
We are in the original Constitution. We're in the Constitution in several places, but originally the Constitution calls for teaching vocational subjects, I think specifically vocational agriculture and home economics at that time. And we have always had a state director of vocational education, but in the teens and 20s and 30s, the state director was the state superintendent of public instruction. And so the state superintendent would wear the hat of state director and go to the state director meetings. But in 1942, and frankly, I'm not sure that I know, or at least I can't remember the impetus for this, but 1942, Mr. Perkey became the full-time state director of vocational education. And the State Board of Vocational Education was created, which meant that the Board for Vocational Education was no longer the board for the state common education system. And along a few years later, A&M College, Wilhelm, I think, offered some space off campus to the agency and moved the headquarters to Stillwater, and so that's how the physical location became as it is. Having a separate state board of vocational education is everything. It's not just symbolic, but it is analogous, I think, to well, let me do it a little better maybe. It's when the area school concept first came into being, the thought was we'll go to, and this was the first experiment in area schools, we'll go to Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Enid, Ardmore, and Duncan, and attach the area school to the common school. So in Oklahoma City, I was teaching at U.S. Grant at the time, they built the Oklahoma City Area Vocational Center. It wasn't a school, it was an area vocational center. And the superintendent of Oklahoma City Public Schools, which was true in Tulsa and Enid, Duncan Hardworth as well. The superintendent was the superintendent of the area vocational school center, or area vocational center at, on South Bryan. And the Oklahoma City Public School Board was the school board for Oklahoma City, including the South Bryan Center. And as a young pup, I'd go to school board meetings and remember Cy Bowen, who was the first director. He wasn't either. He was the first principal. They weren't even directors. They were principals at the area school, of the area centers, just like the principal at U.S. Grant was principal, and had the same standing, same salary, and that sort of thing. Well, I remember going to those board meetings, and they'd do all, buy buses and, had to deal with this and deal with band uniforms and cheerleaders and whatever else they were doing. And oh, by the way, Mr. Boland's here, and he has a report on the vocational center. And so I would get about 4 minutes and 12 seconds of attention. And quickly, we saw that we need school boards that pay attention to the vocational program. Don't ever forget how hard this work is that we do. It is hard to be a common school administrator when you have to find English teachers and history teachers and science teachers and so forth, and deal with all the peripheral activities. But to deal in the subject of teaching people how to earn a living successfully is such important work, but it is also more expensive work. It just costs a whole lot more to run a vocational program than it does to run a history class or even a band program. So that same philosophy carries through at the state level. And my counterparts, when I was at the agency in other states, would be treated like Mr. Boland was. They'd go to State Board of Education meetings, and oh, by